Welcome to First Sleep Aid, calm stories to help you unwind, learn, and fall asleep. From true crime to curious facts and thoughtful ideas, always softly spoken. Subscribe now and take a deep breath. You're in good hands.
Welcome, curious minds. Today we're taking you to a place that truly defies easy answers, a quiet community tucked deep in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. What happened there in 1981 isn't just a crime story. It's a profound look at how a single event can shatter a community and leave questions echoing for decades.
Absolutely. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's a deep dive into the profound echoes that remain when a mystery, despite tantalizing clues, finds no resolution. We've gathered a stack of sources, articles, and research rich with detail, painting a vivid picture of a community, a family, and a chilling series of events that would leave an indelible mark on everyone it touched.
Our mission today is to thoroughly unpack the layers of this particular case. The tragic night itself, the lives irrevocably altered, the baffling inconsistencies of the investigation, and the enduring questions that linger. It's a story of human courage, heartbreaking vulnerability, and the profound cost of forgotten truth. So let's begin this deep dive. When we talk about Keddie in 1981, it's crucial to understand it wasn't a bustling town by any stretch of the imagination. Instead, picture a quiet, almost decaying memory of what it once was. This place certainly had a past, a vibrant life as a lively junction on the Western Pacific Railroad line.
Oh, yeah. Back in its heyday, freight trains would roar through the canyon, their powerful engines shaking the ground, and the depot would bustle with workers, travelers, and the constant hum of activity, promising endless movement and connection to the wider world.
But that was decades ago, right? By the early 1980s, that vital heartbeat had slowed to a mere whisper. The train tracks had long since gone silent, just faint, rusted imprints on a landscape that seemed to be forgetting its own history.
And the economic decline was palpable, visible in every shuttered storefront and weathered building. The train depot, once the lifeblood of Keddie, closed its doors, and with it, the jobs that had sustained generations of families simply vanished. The once thriving logging industry, which had provided steady work for mill hands, dwindled to a few desperate operations before fading entirely.
So the tourists left too.
Yeah, tourists who once flocked here to fish the clear waters of the Feather River or hike the winding mountain trails had moved on, seeking newer, cleaner places, as the locals sometimes lamented. Places with more modern amenities and a fresher veneer. What was left in Keddie was a community clinging to its last threads, fewer than 100 souls remaining in what felt more like a ghost town than a thriving community. It had become a haven for the forgotten, the trying, and the barely getting by, a place where ambition often succumbed to sheer survival.
That's a powerful image, a place for the forgotten. And the people who remained, they truly were a specific kind, a real patchwork of working-class resilience and rural isolation. You have the retired railroad men, their lives still tied to the tracks that no longer hummed with activity, their stories echoing the town's lost prosperity.
Right. And there were divorced mothers struggling to make ends meet, often relying on government assistance like food stamps, out-of-work mill hands whose livelihoods had dried up entirely, leaving them with little but their skills and their pride. And occasionally, a drifter passing through, seeking temporary rest beneath a roof that asked very few questions, a transient presence in a place that seemed stuck in time.
It was a community carved out of necessity, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Out of a shared, quiet desperation where self-reliance was less a virtue and more a daily requirement.
Despite the pervasive decay and the visible signs of hardship, it's important to understand that Keddie still held a strange charm. In spring, the vibrant white dogwoods would bloom vividly along the hillsides, a sudden splash of color against the fading landscape, a stark contrast to the quiet rust.
I can picture that.
The Feather River shimmered with cold mountain runoff, a constant soothing presence, its gentle murmur often the loudest sound in the valley. Children still played in muddy yards, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls, and neighbors, in their quiet way, would nod to each other at dusk, a silent acknowledgement of shared struggles and enduring familiarity.
It was that kind of place where everyone knew the color of your truck and, more intimately, the names of your children, where anonymity was nearly impossible.
Exactly.
So on the surface, a quaint if struggling place. But beneath that quiet familiarity, there was an undercurrent of unease. It wasn't spoken, not overtly present, but it was there, a subtle tension in the mountain air. Keddie was small enough to keep secrets and just large enough to bury them, a phrase that, in hindsight, takes on a chilling significance.
Yeah, that really hits differently now. This wasn't a place that invited scrutiny or where outsiders lingered too long. And as darkness fell, the dense pine trees seemed to close in, pressing down on the isolated community, making the world outside the few lit cabins feel vast and unknowable.
That sense of foreboding, that quiet unease, perfectly foreshadowed the unspeakable events that were about to unfold in April of 1981. It forces you to imagine a community clinging to its last threads, where the calm exterior hides deeper unspoken vulnerabilities, a kind of vulnerability that can attract the very darkness it seeks to keep out.
Against this backdrop, Glenna Susan Sharp, known to everyone simply as Sue, arrived in Keddie in the fall of 1980. She was a 36-year-old mother of five driving a beat-up blue Plymouth station wagon loaded with what little she had left.
And her journey there was an escape, right? A desperate flight from a broken marriage in Connecticut.
Absolutely, a relationship that had disintegrated under the crushing weight of abuse and alcohol. Her husband, James Sharp, a military man, had a notorious temper, and Sue had endured years of his violence. She made the courageous decision to seek distance over danger, choosing California as a chance at reinvention. She had no job waiting for her, no family in the state, just the raw, unwavering hope that this small, quiet town in the Sierra Nevada might offer the peace she desperately craved and the safety she had been denied for too long.
Sue's character, as you describe it, truly stands out. She was thin, with tired eyes that hinted at the burden she carried, but she possessed a kindness that seemed both sincere and hard-won. There was nothing outwardly extraordinary about her, no grand gestures or loud declarations. Yet to those who paid attention, she exuded a rare steadiness in the face of uncertainty.
That's right. She wasn't one to ask for pity, nor did she dwell on loss or past hardships. She simply moved forward, one determined decision at a time, focused on her children. It's a quiet strength, isn't it? Trying to create a sanctuary for her children against a backdrop of immense personal and economic hardship, a struggle so many listeners, especially single mothers, can understand and empathize with.
Definitely. And life in Cabin 28, where Sue and her children settled, was modest, to say the least.
Oh, very modest. It was one of many identical boxy structures in the dilapidated Keddie resort, each showing the wear of decades. It had 2 bedrooms, no insulation, and a porch that sloped noticeably to the left, hinting at its age and disrepair. It was certainly not luxurious, but within its thin walls, the Sharp household, though often chaotic, with 5 children underfoot, was never unloving.
And she raised them with soft rules and firm expectations. Honesty and kindness mattered most.
Exactly. Their existence was largely sustained by government checks and food assistance, a constant financial tightrope walk. Yet, amidst the daily struggle, Sue held quiet, persistent dreams of pursuing a nursing degree once her children were older, a pathway to more stability and independence.
And her children, each with their own distinct personalities, trying to find their way in this new, isolated world. There was John, the oldest son, 15 years old, restless, headstrong, and increasingly drawn to the thrill of independence, often chafing against the constraints of their poverty and isolation.
Then Sheila, the eldest daughter at 14, she was more cautious. A teenager shouldering too much responsibility for her age, often stepping into a maternal role for her younger siblings. Tina, 12, who was caught between childhood and adolescence with a deep need to belong, often quiet and observant. And finally, Rick and Greg, both under 10, the youngest, still small enough to sleep without locking their doors, seemingly innocent of the worries their older siblings carried.
It sounds like Sue is acutely aware of their vulnerability as a single mother with 5 children in such a forgotten town.
Oh, absolutely. She worked tirelessly to shield them, establishing routine school in the morning, chores in the evening, and the occasional movie in Quincy when she could scrape together enough money for the gas and tickets. She tried to create a sense of normalcy and protection. They truly didn't have much in terms of possessions or financial security, but they certainly had each other, a tight-knit unit. In Cabin 28, Sue was constantly trying to build a life that made sense, a life that promised some semblance of peace, a quiet sanctuary from the struggles they faced.
That attempt to build a sanctuary brings us directly to Cabin 28 itself, the very epicenter of this tragedy. It's at near the end of a gravel lane, a boxy wooden structure with weather-stained siding, faded blue trim, and a porch that leaned slightly left. It was unassuming, unremarkable even, the kind of place you wouldn't notice until you had to.
Exactly. It had once been part of the Keddie Resort, built as a quaint summer getaway for Sacramento families seeking refuge from the heat and the city bustle. But by 1981, with the resort long past its prime, it was purely transitional housing, cheap, available, and for families like the Sharps, it offered a fragile, fresh start, a place to begin again, even if it was threadbare.
Inside, the layout was cramped but functional, designed more for practicality than comfort. Two small bedrooms, a minimal kitchen, a living room that often doubled as a sleeping area.
Yeah, and the floorboards creaked with every step. The walls were notoriously thin, allowing sounds to travel easily between rooms, but also making the cabin feel exposed. The mountain cold would seep in through every seam and crack during the long winters, forcing them to bundle up indoors. It was a house that showed its age and its wear, a physical manifestation of the tough lives lived within its walls.
Despite these limitations, Sue truly made an effort to make it a home. She tacked up school photos on the walls, neatly laid blankets at the foot of each bed, tried to make it as cozy as possible, and made sure to buy groceries every Friday, letting the kids pick one treat each as a small luxury.
Right. And while there were inevitably arguments, slammed doors, and the weary sighs of a mother stretched thin, the cabin also echoed with laughter, board games, and moments of ordinary warmth. Simple joys that often get overlooked in these kinds of stories. What Cabin 28 lacked in sturdy structure and modern conveniences, the Sharps undeniably filled in with their own resilience and familial affection.
But the crucial, chilling detail, the one that truly sets the stage for the coming horror, is the distinct lack of security. The Keddie cabins, including Cabin 28, had no security, no patrol, no neighborly watchfulness.
Just the gravel lane and the forest. There were no streetlights, no busy roads. The line between inside and out was frighteningly paper thin, meaning you could knock on a door or even push it open and be inside before anyone even had time to say no. At night, the darkness pressed close, thick with shadows and the whisper of wind through the pines. There was a pervasive, almost naive sense of safety in this isolated community.
And this leads us to the most unsettling detail, the one that everyone seemed to repeat afterward. No one locked their doors in Keddie. That's what they said afterward. No one thought they had to. This speaks volumes about the perceived safety, the trust, however misplaced, that existed in this remote mountain community.
Yeah, a trust that was utterly shattered on that fateful April night, leaving this family's sanctuary utterly exposed to the darkness that arrived, unexpected and uninvited.
Saturday night in Keddie didn't arrive with the fanfare of city lights or the buzz of late-night activity. It came quietly, like mist settling between trees. As the rugged mountains grew darker, casting long, deep shadows, the little town fell into a deeper silence, a peaceful facade before the storm.
Inside Cabin 28, Sue Sharp was in the kitchen, making dinner for her children. The television flickered in the living room, its gentle glow casting moving shadows on the paneled walls, while the younger children were curled up on the floor, mesmerized by cartoons, perhaps a Saturday night special. This paints such a vivid picture of serene domesticity, the kind of ordinary calm that would soon be brutally ripped apart.
Her oldest son, John, who was 15, had plans that night with his friend Dana Wingate, 17. They were headed into Quincy, the larger town nearby, most likely hitchhiking, a common and seemingly harmless practice in those days for kids looking for a bit of excitement.
Right. Dana was described as lean, a bit restless himself, freshly reunited with John after some time away. They shared a love for rock music, the occasional illicit beer, and that restless energy that made a Saturday night in Quincy feel like a big adventure, a world away from the quiet of Keddie. They didn't even leave until after dark, eager to make the most of their evening.
Meanwhile, Sue's daughter, Sheila, 14, had a sleepover planned at a neighboring cabin, Cabin 27, a brief reprieve from the crowded house. Tina, just 12, had stayed home, along with the younger boys, Rick and Greg, both under 10, and their friend Justin Smart, who was sleeping over. A typical Saturday night, it seemed.
The last confirmed moment of this fragile calm came sometime around 9:30 p.m. After that, the timeline completely unravels into uncertainty, swallowed by the events that followed. What's even more chilling is that some neighbors did report hearing things in the night. Voices raised, agitated, a thump, the sound of something breaking.
But nobody called for help.
No. These sounds, however, were critically unheeded. No one called for help. In a small, isolated place like Keddie, noise was common from the cabins. Arguments flared and fizzled, children played late, and the vast night air seemed to swallow sound as effectively as the forest swallowed light. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this chilling quiet of that night underscores a tragic missed opportunity for intervention. It highlights a community that, by virtue of its isolation and perhaps a certain self-contained resilience, didn't immediately perceive a threat, a silence that would haunt the case for decades.
What happened next inside Cabin 28 remained shrouded in mystery. But one thing is tragically certain. Violence bloomed. Sudden, brutal, and ferocious. Somewhere between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., Cabin 28 underwent a horrifying transformation. It went from refuge into crime scene, from shelter into legend.
The details are sparse, obscured by the darkness and the absence of witnesses, but the outcome was devastating. And the most haunting detail of all: not a single call was made to the sheriff's office that night. No shites for help, no alarms raised. The quiet of Keddie held its breath, and in that silence, a family was destroyed.
It was just past 7 a.m. on Easter Sunday, April 12, when Sheila Sharp, a 14-year-old girl, returned to Cabin 28. She had spent the night in a neighboring cabin, completely unaware that her family's lives had been shattered just yards from where she slept. The morning air was cool, pine-scented, and deceptively serene.
Yeah, as she approached the front door, perhaps expecting the usual chaos of breakfast or a quiet start to the holiday. But the cabin was unnaturally quiet. Too quiet. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air settled over her.
What Sheila saw when she stepped inside would be burned into her memory forever, a vision of unspeakable horror. It was 3 bodies, a scene of staggering violence. Her mother, Sue Sharp, lay on her side near the living room couch, partially covered with a yellow blanket, as if someone had tried awkwardly to conceal her or perhaps contain the horror.
Close by, her brother John and his friend Dana lay face up and face down, bound with medical and electrical tape. The bindings, it was noted by early investigators, were sloppy, almost frantic, but their intents unmistakable. To restrain, to control.
The extent of the violence was truly horrifying, a scene of immense brutality. Blood was everywhere. It soaked the carpet, splattered the furniture, dotted the walls, painting a gruesome tableau.
And the weapons used were equally brutal, domestic objects turned instruments of death. A kitchen knife was embedded in the side of Sue's chest. Another, bent from force, lay nearby, suggesting extreme exertion. A claw hammer had been used with such violence it had fractured bone and bent metal, inflicting devastating trauma. Yet, amidst this gruesome tableau, a chilling detail emerged that profoundly baffled investigators. Nothing had been stolen.
Nothing stolen, and no forced entry.
Right, there were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or forced locks. This indicated that the scene was not the result of a frenzied robbery, but something far more personal. It was deliberate, intimate, rage and control hand in hand, suggesting a deeply personal motive rather than opportunistic crime.
Sheila didn't linger. The shock and horror propelled her backward. She ran, screaming, back to Cabin 27, her screams finally shattering the eerie silence of the morning. What followed was pure confusion and chaos. Neighbors rushed over, drawn by Sheila's cries and the unsettling quiet. Eventually, someone finally called the sheriff's office.
Officers from Plumas County arrived within the hour, but even in those first frantic minutes, the integrity of the crime scene began to tragically collapse. People, trying to help or simply driven by morbid curiosity, were walking through the cabin. Someone even covered Sue again with a sheet, inadvertently contaminating crucial trace evidence. Microscopic fibers, hairs, skin cells, elements that could have definitively linked an attacker to the scene.
Oh, no.
Others, in their attempts to comfort the distraught surviving children, moved objects, creating further complications for forensic analysis. Imagine the unspeakable horror of discovering such a scene, and then compounded by the immediate critical errors that compromised any chance for quick answers or clear evidence.
And then, as the initial shock began to subside, came the truly shocking discovery of the boys.
Yes. When police opened the small bedroom door in the back of the cabin, they found Rick and Greg Sharp unharmed, along with Justin Smart, who was sleeping over. They were untouched, seemingly asleep through it all, oblivious to the carnage that had unfolded just meters away. This posed a profound, decades-long question for investigators and the public alike. 3 young boys had slept through a triple homicide, or had they? It added another layer of bewildering mystery to an already unfathomable crime.
And the deepest mystery of all, the most haunting absence. Tina. Tina was gone. She wasn't among the dead. She wasn't found in the house. She was simply missing, as if she had evaporated into the mountain air.
At the back of Cabin 28, behind a flimsy hollow core door, Rick and Greg Sharp, aged 10 and 5, along with 12-year-old Justin Smart, rubbed sleep from their eyes in the small, sparsely furnished room. What they heard, or didn't hear, that night has been the subject of intense speculation and debate for decades.
According to their initial accounts, given amidst profound shock, they slept through everything. The pounding of fists, the breaking of bones, the stifled cries of three people dying only meters away. The killers had entered, committed horrific acts, and somehow these children had not stirred, or so it was believed.
Or so they initially claimed. Justin's story, in particular, would later change dramatically, adding a complex psychological layer to the investigation. Under hypnosis, a controversial technique then sometimes used in investigations, but administered in this case by an unlicensed investigator, he described witnessing parts of the attack.
Hypnosis. That sounds problematic.
Extremely. He spoke of a struggle, blurred faces, perhaps two, maybe three men, one with long dark hair and sunglasses, another in a military jacket.
These were vague outlines, faded sketches of terror, images that perhaps existed more in a traumatic dream space than in concrete memory.
And hypnosis can induce false memories, right? Especially if not done properly. Exactly. That's why, especially when administered by an unlicensed investigator, such testimony is widely dismissed in courts, creating a persistent evidentiary void and leaving questions hanging in the air. Under direct questioning, he later denied it all, further blurring the lines. No physical evidence ever supported these hypnotically induced visions. The debate raged for years. Was it dream, trauma, or suggestion? The trauma, though, for Justin and the Sharp boys, was undeniably real and profoundly impactful.
Rick and Greg, too young to fully process the horror, were taken into custody that morning, not as suspects but as children in profound shock. They spoke little, asked for their mother in hushed tones, and clung to each other, small figures lost in a terrifying adult world.
Critically, the investigators, who were disorganized and underprepared for a crime of this magnitude, offered no clarity, no psychological support, no debriefing for these traumatized children. This was a significant, heartbreaking oversight, leaving them adrift in the aftermath of unimaginable violence.
And as for Tina, the 12-year-old daughter, she remained missing, her absence a gaping wound. She hadn't been in the boys' room. She wasn't among the dead. Her coat and shoes were gone, suggesting she might have left willingly, but there was no note, no witness to her departure. Not even a theory that made any coherent sense, leaving investigators bewildered.
So while the youngest Sharp children had been physically spared, what they saw, heard, or were made to forget would haunt them for life. A profound silence had settled over Keddie. Not peace, not resolution, just silence.
This case forces us to confront a terrifying psychological truth. How trauma doesn't just scar, it can fundamentally alter memory, creating a labyrinth that even seasoned investigators struggle to navigate. The boys' conflicting accounts aren't just details. They're a stark reminder of how fragile truth can be in the face of immense suffering.
Glenna Susan Sharp, known to everyone as Sue, was 36 when her life was violently ended in Cabin 28. But her story truly began years before with an escape. In 1979, she packed her 5 children into that beat-up blue Plymouth station wagon and fled Connecticut, leaving behind a marriage that had completely disintegrated under the crushing weight of abuse and alcoholism.
Her husband, James Sharp, a former military man, had a notorious temper and a history of violence that had deeply scarred their family.
Yeah, exactly. Sue, demonstrating immense courage, chose distance over danger, arriving in California with little more than her kids and a sense of resolve. She saw Keddie, for all its isolation and decay, as her chance at reinvention, a remote haven where they could finally find quiet and the safety she had so desperately sought.
Cabin 28 for Sue was never home in the romantic sense. It was survival. It was a low-rent unit in a decaying resort town where the railroad had moved on. An opportunity had completely rusted with the tracks.
And as a single mother with 5 children, Sue is often seen as an outsider in the tight-knit but not always kind community. Her neighbors described her as reserved but polite, fiercely protective of her children, and notably, not one for gossip, which often set her apart in a small, insular community. She actively tried to better herself and their circumstances, enrolling in business classes at Feather River College in Quincy, walking regularly to the local unemployment office for food stamps, and attending church when she could, all while juggling the demands of motherhood.
But behind the cabin's thin walls, Sue's life was fraying, hidden from public view. John, her eldest, was restless, angry, and growing wild, often clashing with his mother as he pushed for independence. Tina had begun to drift, spending long hours away from home, searching for connection elsewhere.
And Sue worried deeply about them, but desperately lacked the resources or external support system to intervene effectively. She was often alone, isolated, managing pain quietly like so many women before her, the quiet burden of a single mother struggling in a forgotten corner of the world. On the night of April 11th, her final evening, she was wearing a blue bathrobe, her shoulder-length hair parted down the middle, watching TV with her younger boys before bedtime. A scene of quiet domesticity about to be obliterated.
When she was found the next morning, the stark reality of the violence was horrifying. Her hands and feet were bound with medical tape, a detail suggesting control and deliberate action. Her injuries were extensive: blows to the head, multiple stab wounds, strangulation.
The sheer brutality of the attack suggested profound rage, a deeply personal fury, while the meticulous bindings suggested calculation, a methodical approach to the horror. The autopsy chillingly revealed that Sue had fought back. Defensive wounds, cuts, and bruises on her arms and hands, and torn tissue were clear indicators of a desperate struggle. She hadn't gone quietly, confirming her resilience even in her final moments.
Her life, and what it meant as a survivor, was tragically eclipsed by the sensational mystery of her death. She became a symbol, a question mark, a headline. The mother in the cabin, reduced to a tragic archetype.
In truth, she was so much more than a headline. She was a woman who had left violence behind, only to meet it again in a darker form, a survivor, a fighter. She became a ghost, not because of her death itself, but because no one truly saw her while she lived, her struggles and quiet strength overlooked until they were tragically illuminated by unthinkable violence.
It's a profound tragedy to reflect on the quiet resilience of a mother trying to build a new life for her children, only for that effort to be so violently and unjustly extinguished.
John Sharp was 15, not 17, when his life was cut short. A tall, lanky teenager with a quiet intensity that masked the volatility of his age. He carried his mother's dark hair and a simmering need to be anywhere but home. He resented the poverty, the isolation of Keddie, and the heavy weight of being the eldest in a struggling family.
In Keddie, there was seemingly nothing to do and nowhere to go, and John had grown restless within that vacuum, a boundless energy with no outlet.
Exactly. He'd dropped out of school, drifted through odd jobs, and indulged in smoking and drinking, common teenage rebellions that, in his isolated world, felt amplified. He got into trouble, not criminal trouble in a serious sense, but the kind that made adults whisper and police look twice. He fought with Sue often, a natural tension of adolescence and circumstance, yet there was an underlying love. But the small house felt stifling, and John constantly felt the need to push against something, anything, for freedom.
Dana Wingate was a little different, a bit younger at 17, more affable, with a dimpled grin that seemed to mask his own troubles. The Wingates had recently moved to Quincy, and Dana had a knack for slipping between social circles with ease. Athletes, stoners, loners, all seemed to welcome him.
His own home life was reportedly troubled, though Dana rarely spoke of it, keeping his pain private. What truly bonded John and Dana was their mutual hunger for freedom, a shared desire to escape the confines of their small-town lives, if only for a night. On the night of April 11th, they had spent the day in Quincy, a small adventure, and were desperately trying to find a ride back to Keddie. They were seen hitchhiking and laughing, two seemingly carefree teenagers, but tragically, no one remembers who last gave them a lift.
No one ever admitted it.
No, it created a crucial void in the timeline. By the time they returned to Cabin 28, Sue had already put the younger kids to bed. Sheila was at her sleepover. Tina may have even been asleep in her room. The precise hours between their arrival and the massacre remain an impenetrable black hole, a period of terrifying uncertainty.
John was found bound, lying near his mother, his throat slit so deeply it nearly decapitated him, a truly gruesome injury. Dana lay nearby, his head bashed in, his hands bearing signs of restraint, indicating a struggle or attempts to tie him.
Both boys had suffered long and violent deaths, inflicted with extreme force and multiple weapons. Dana, who wasn't even supposed to be there that night, had simply vanished into the wrong place at the wrong time, an innocent caught in the crossfire.
This raises a crucial question for investigators that still haunts the case. What exactly were John and Dana doing in that room? Were they targeted, or did they simply walk into an unfolding horror?
That's a terrifying thought. Theories about drug deals, revenge, or personal vendettas have certainly circulated, and some early investigators explored them, but none of them truly account for the raw, frenzied nature of the violence observed at the scene. This wasn't just about killing. This was to punish, to silence, suggesting a deeply personal motive rooted in rage or a desire for control.
And neither boy had a criminal record or known enemies.
Not on paper, no. Yet, tragically, someone wanted them dead badly and delivered a level of violence that shocked even hardened officers. They are often referred to in tandem, John and Dana, as if they were one, forever linked by the horror of that night. But they were two distinct and unfinished boys, two young lives cut short not just by the blades and bludgeons, but by what some would argue was the apathy of a town unwilling or unable to protect its own.
In the years that followed, Dana's name faded faster from the narrative. His family moved, and his face appeared less often in the clippings. But John remained tethered to the narrative, the son who died at his mother's feet, the son who might have known more, the son who maybe fought last, his story forever intertwined with the central mystery.
Sometimes the most haunting presence is, in fact, an absence, and that's Tina Sharp's story. At 12 years old, she was quiet, shy, the kind of girl who clung to the edges of rooms, often observing rather than participating. At school, she struggled academically and socially, a quiet struggle that was often overlooked. The family's frequent moves, a consequence of their unstable life, had left Tina with few friends and little stability, making it difficult for her to form lasting bonds.
In photographs, she rarely smiles with her teeth. She often looks inward as if already retreating from a world that made little space for her. A poignant image of a child on the cusp of adolescence, struggling to find her place.
On the night of April 11, Tina had definitely been at Cabin 28. Her surviving siblings, Justin, Rick, and Greg, all distinctly remember seeing her in her nightgown, possibly watching television with them. Then, at some point between late evening and early morning, she was gone.
When the bodies of Sue, John, and Dana were discovered the next day, Tina was simply missing. There was no trace of her found in the house, not a footprint, not a single drop of blood, not a cry heard through the thin cabin walls, which was all the more puzzling given the extreme violence that had occurred. Her coat and shoes were gone, suggesting she might have left willingly, but no note was found, no witness to her departure. Not even a theory that made any coherent sense to investigators, leaving them bewildered and with a profound void in the case.
For a time, hope persisted, though it dwindled with each passing day. Maybe she had fled in terror and was hiding somewhere. Maybe she had been taken by someone who would return her. Maybe she was still alive somewhere. The FBI was called in, dogs searched the dense woods for days, flyers went up across California and beyond, and Tina's freckled, solemn face appeared on milk cartons, a desperate plea to the public. But the trail ran cold. Despite extensive efforts, it was as if the forest had swallowed her whole, leaving no trace.
And then, 3 years later, the woods spoke. On April 2010, 1984, the silence around Tina's disappearance was brutally broken. A bottle collector scavenging along a remote logging road near Camp 18 in neighboring Butte County, nearly 100 kilometers away and about 50 miles from Keddie, made a grisly discovery.
There, amidst the quiet forest floor, lay fragments of a human skull. Local authorities were called, and soon additional remains surfaced. A jawbone, bits of clothing consistent with a child's vertebra. They were scattered, partially buried, and had been lying in wait beneath the pine needles of a forest rarely visited, exposed to the elements for years.
Dental records tragically confirmed the unimaginable. The remains belonged unequivocally to Tina Sharp, the 12-year-old girl who had vanished the night of the murders. Her discovery, so far from Keddie, raised critical, haunting questions. What was she doing there? How had she died? Was she murdered at Cabin 28 and then transported, possibly by vehicle, so far from the original crime scene? Or had she been kept alive, hidden, perhaps even used, and then discarded?
These were questions that should have prompted an immediate flurry of action and a meticulous investigation of the new site. Instead, the moment was quietly folded into the ongoing neglect of the case.
The site where Tina's remains were found was never properly sealed off, a shocking repeat of the original crime scene errors. No forensic team combed the area with any urgency, meaning critical trace evidence was likely lost to the elements and time. Search dogs weren't deployed to scour the surrounding forest for additional remains or clues. Whatever crucial clues the forest still held, whatever secrets Tina's final resting place contained, were simply left to rot, just like the rest of the case. A profound failure of process.
Only one object of note was found alongside her remains. A fragment of blue surgical tape, like the kind used to gag someone, a chilling echo of the bindings found on her mother and brother. For the Sharp family, it was a second funeral, not just for Tina, but for any lingering hope that the system would ever deliver justice.
And for the community, those who remember Tina as a shy, soft-spoken girl, it was a profound rupture in time. The crime, seemingly contained in the past, had suddenly leapt into the present, from rumor into ruin. The forest itself seemed to speak, finally giving a voice to Tina, but the system's response was still tragically muted. What remained was no longer just a mystery, it was a disturbing pattern. A body buried not just in the woods, but beneath layers of institutional failure and neglect.
Keddie was never a town built for secrets, as we discussed. It was a place where doors were often left unlocked, where the rhythm of life was slow and predictable, fostering a false sense of security. But after the murders, everything changed dramatically. In the days that followed April 12th, 1981, fear spread through Keddie like smoke from an unseen fire.
Parents kept their children indoors, locking doors that had never been locked before, and strangers were eyed with palpable suspicion.
Right. But the greater unease, the more insidious dread, came not from outsiders, but from within the community itself. People began to believe something unthinkable, that whoever had committed this heinous crime had not, in fact, left town. The killer, or killers, were still among them.
Rumors gathered like snow on pine branches, heavy and pervasive. One theory suggested a satanic cult, given the brutal nature of the killings and some community anxieties at the time, while another whispered about a drug deal gone horribly wrong, fueled by the isolation and the transient nature of some residents.
But beneath these more sensational conspiracy theories lay a quieter, far more unsettling possibility that the killers were familiar faces, that they had sat in the same bar, shopped in the same general store, waved to the same neighbors, creating a chilling sense of betrayal. Some residents began to speak, cautiously at first, of a man named Martin Smart. He lived just a few cabins away from Cabin 28, a volatile figure known for his unpredictable outbursts and strange, erratic behavior.
And on the night of the murders, he claimed to be out with a friend, Beau Boubade, a drifter with a criminal past.
That's the one. Both men were questioned by police, but crucially, neither was arrested, despite their suspicious presence and conflicting accounts. Then came the inconsistencies that would plague the case for decades, creating a labyrinth of doubt. Martin Smart allegedly told a counselor at the VA hospital in Reno, Nevada, that he had killed the woman and her daughter, but didn't have anything to do with the boys.
A potential confession.
Exactly. A significant one. Yet it was never officially recorded by law enforcement in any formal way. When the counselor bravely passed this information to law enforcement, providing a detailed account, nothing tangible came of it. Years later, that very counselor, clearly frustrated and disillusioned, would state with profound conviction, "I gave them everything, they buried it," suggesting a deliberate act of suppression rather than mere oversight.
It wasn't just this alleged confession that seemed to vanish. Other testimonies seemed to disappear into dead ends, witnesses interviewed but their statements seemingly disregarded. Critical evidence went missing from the crime scene, and vital files disappeared from the sheriff's office.
Yeah, these were the kinds of errors that some might charitably call incompetence. Perhaps a small, overwhelmed department making mistakes under pressure. But others, particularly those close to the case, suspected something darker, a deliberate effort to derail the investigation. Behind closed doors, residents started comparing notes, frustrated by how certain leads hadn't been followed, how investigators seemed oddly uninterested in basic follow-ups, particularly regarding Smart and Boubade.
The Sharp family, especially Sheila, felt the system had profoundly failed them, encountering a wall of resistance, feeling more like a problem for investigators than a family seeking justice. The insidious nature of community suspicion becomes palpable when official answers are missing, and the terrifying thought that the monsters were, in fact, neighbors, breeds a deep-seated fear and distrust.
Keddie, once a relatively close-knit community where everyone knew everyone, became profoundly fractured by the unresolved horror. Families moved away, unable to live with the lingering dread and suspicion. Others stayed, but conversations ceased. Trust eroded, replaced by guarded silences. Over time, the town emptied, not just of people, but of trust itself, leaving a pervasive dust of suspicion visible only when disturbed.
For many, the question was no longer simply who had done it, but why no one had ever been held accountable. The murders were brutal, but the profound silence that followed, the lack of resolution, may have been even worse, an ongoing trauma.
As the Sharp family's murders shocked Northern California, the official investigation quickly unraveled into a complex knot of contradictions, omissions, and suppressed truth. Yet, even within the thick fog of the case, two names repeatedly emerged as central figures of suspicion: Martin Smart and Beau Boubade.
Martin Smart lived just a few doors down from Cabin 28 in Cabin 26. He's a deeply troubled man, described by acquaintances as erratic, paranoid, and occasionally violent, especially when drinking. His marriage to Marilyn Smart was collapsing, and domestic tensions within his home were well known in the small Keddie community.
And coincidentally, or perhaps by design, on the very night of the murders, his wife Marilyn left him, moving out to a relative's house. Bo Boobaid, on the other hand, was a far less known figure, at least officially, in Keddie. He was a former Chicago enforcer with reported ties to organized crime who had only arrived in Keddie weeks before the murders, seemingly out of nowhere.
He was Smart's housemate and friend, though some speculate it was more than that. Perhaps Bo was a manipulator, even a handler with a darker purpose.
Right. Others believe Bo was a fugitive hiding in plain sight, potentially aided by old connections from his past. Both men claim to have been out drinking heavily the night of April 11th, returning home sometime after midnight, their alibis vague and sometimes contradictory when questioned by police. Bo would later disappear from the area, vanishing as quickly as he arrived, while Martin, though he remained in Keddie for a time, was barely present in the investigation's focus.
Years later, in a chilling FBI interview conducted in 2011, Marilyn Smart uttered something that still resonates. "I think Martin hated Sue. I think he was involved. And I think he wasn't alone." Her statement was clear and direct, a stark contrast to the previous silence. When asked why she hadn't come forward sooner with such a profound suspicion, her answer was heartbreakingly simple. Because no one asked.
Wow. It truly highlights how silence can be imposed. Multiple pieces of circumstantial evidence certainly pointed toward the pair. A bloody claw hammer, long missing from the crime scene inventory, mysteriously turned up years later in a nearby pond, and it chillingly matched a description Martin himself had previously given to authorities.
And there was a letter.
Yes, a handwritten letter, discovered in his abandoned belongings years later, seemed to reference guilt and regret. A confessional hint, and a lie detector test, which Martin reportedly failed, though the results were never formally recorded, rendering them inadmissible in court.
This raises a critical question about the integrity of the investigation. Why was Bo Boobaid never properly investigated, especially given his background and his sudden disappearance?
Some believe he was protected, perhaps by friends in law enforcement or by ghosts from his past who wanted him kept quiet. It's noteworthy that the sheriff at the time had reportedly served in military intelligence, and whispers of interference began to circulate almost immediately. This suggests a systematic failure rather than mere incompetence, hinting at a thin line between gross negligence and deliberate obstruction, especially when connections within a small community are involved.
Over the decades, true crime researchers, former investigators, and independent journalists have diligently re-examined the case, and many agree. Martin and Bo should have been prime suspects, rigorously pursued.
But in the fragile machinery of small-town justice, things are rarely simple. Files vanished, evidence degraded, key people died, and still no one was charged. Many believe the killers were identified early on, but for reasons buried in personal ties, fear, or institutional inertia, that organizational resistance to changing course or admitting errors, they were never brought to justice.
If silence hung heavy over Keddie in the spring of 1981, it was a silence shaped not just by profound grief, but by profound gaps. Gaps in memory, unsettling gaps in witness statements, and most troubling of all, gaping holes in the investigation itself.
From the very beginning, critical missteps irrevocably undermined the case and, in many ways, sealed its fate. The crime scene was not secured effectively. For hours after the bodies were discovered, curious neighbors and even media personnel were allowed to enter Cabin 28, trampling potential footprints, handling evidence without gloves, and moving objects, many of which were never accurately documented or returned. This initial chaos severely compromised the integrity of the scene, making it incredibly difficult to gather crucial forensic evidence later.
The Plumas County Sheriff's Department, being small and notably under-resourced, genuinely seemed overwhelmed by the sheer brutality and complexity of a triple homicide. However, the inconsistencies in the investigation went far beyond mere inexperience or lack of equipment.
Key witnesses weren't interviewed until days or even weeks after the murders, by which time memories can fade or be influenced. The surviving children, including the boys who had seemingly slept undisturbed in the next room, were questioned without trauma specialists or legal guardians present, a significant oversight for such young, vulnerable witnesses, potentially invalidating their testimony.
And that composite sketch, circulated, then pulled.
Yeah, depicting a man with dark hair, then inexplicably pulled within days without public explanation, fueling rumors. And several pages of the case file mysteriously went missing, only to resurface years later in unrelated locations, creating a perplexing paper trail of absence and reappearance.
Then there were the truly baffling omissions, the moments when crucial information seemed to simply vanish. Martin Smart, one of the main suspects, allegedly confessed to a counselor at the VA hospital in Reno. That counselor, following protocol, reported the confession to authorities in Plumas County.
And according to later investigations, this crucial report was simply placed in a drawer and never followed up. When new investigators reopened the case decades later and asked why this had happened, the original investigator claimed he simply forgot. Furthermore, a cassette tape recording of an anonymous tip about the killers, a tip later confirmed as highly credible by later investigators, was also seemingly buried. It was only discovered decades later by an independent team meticulously combing through the archives, its contents ignored for far too long.
And most hauntingly, perhaps the most profound omission of all. When Tina Sharp's remains were found in 1984, over 50 miles from Keddie, no alert had ever been issued for her abduction. Her case had quietly slipped from active investigation into a cold file. There was no Amber Alert, which wasn't widely used then, but also no statewide bulletin, no widespread public appeal. Just a quiet disappearance noted and then inexplicably left to fade from urgent inquiry.
For some, this disturbing pattern of errors points clearly to negligence. A small department overwhelmed, making unforgivable mistakes. But for others, it strongly suggests something darker, outright obstruction, a deliberate attempt to suppress the truth. Whispers grew that someone was actively protecting someone, that favors were called in, and that reputations were shielded at the profound cost of justice.
Years later, when new sheriffs inherited the dusty boxes of the Keddie case, they found not just cold evidence, but a deeply broken trust. The Sharp family and an entire community had been failed. Not just by the killer, but by the very institutions meant to protect them, to pursue truth, and to deliver justice.
In Keddie, people eventually stopped asking questions, not because they had answers, but because the answers consistently led nowhere, into a fog of obfuscation and silence. And nowhere was the only place the case seemed to be allowed to go, leaving a profound and festering sense of injustice for a case riddled with errors and potential cover-ups.
3 years passed after the Keddie murders, and by 1984, the horror of Cabin 28 had become something half-remembered in Keddie, a dark bruise beneath the surface of daily life. The Sharp family had moved away, trying to escape the shadow of the tragedy. Cabin 28 stood silent, boarded up, its windows like vacant eyes, and largely avoided by locals, a grim monument to what had happened.
What had once been a case full of urgency was now a closed drawer, a half-hearted whisper in the sheriff's office archive. And then, on April 22, 1984, the woods spoke again, breaking the silence in the most chilling way possible.
Just over 3 years after Tina Sharp had mysteriously disappeared from her family's home, a bottle collector scavenging along a remote logging road near Camp 18 in neighboring Butte County made a grisly discovery. The site was deep in the woods, approximately 50 miles from Keddie, a remote, rugged area rarely traversed. There, amidst the quiet forest floor, lay fragments of a human skull.
Local authorities were called, and soon additional remains surfaced after a preliminary search. A jawbone, bits of clothing consistent with a child's blue jacket, a child's vertebra. They were scattered, partially buried, and had been lying in wait beneath the pine needles of a forest rarely visited, exposed to the elements for years, preserving their secrets.
Dental records tragically confirmed the unimaginable. The remains belonged unequivocally to Tina Sharp, the 12-year-old girl who had vanished the night of the murders. Her discovery, so far from Keddie, raised critical, haunting questions for investigators, questions that still echo today. What was she doing there? How had she died? Why had her body been transported, and likely by vehicle given the distance, so far from the original crime scene?
These were questions that should have prompted an immediate flurry of action, a meticulous sealing and combing of the new crime scene, and a renewed, aggressive investigation. Instead, the moment was quietly folded into the ongoing neglect of the case, another missed opportunity.
The site where Tina's remains were found was never properly sealed off, a shocking echo of the original crime scene errors at Cabin 28. No forensic team combed the area with any urgency or meticulousness. Search dogs weren't deployed to scour the surrounding forest for additional remains or crucial clues that might have been scattered. Whatever crucial clues the forest still held, whatever secrets Tina's final resting place contained, were simply left to rot, just like the rest of the case, a profound and tragic failure of process.
Only one object of note was found alongside her remains that could be considered evidence. A fragment of blue surgical tape, like the kind used to gag someone. A chilling echo of the medical and electrical tape used to bind her mother and brother. The forest itself seemed to speak, finally giving a voice to Tina, but the system's response was still tragically muted, a profound and continued failure. What remained was no longer just a mystery, it was a disturbing pattern. A body buried not just in the woods, but beneath layers of institutional failure and bureaucratic apathy.
For years, the Keddie murders sat in the archive room of the Plymouth County Sheriff's Office like an unhealed wound, a testament to unresolved trauma. There were boxes of paperwork, stacks of grainy photographs, unexamined tape reels, and witness statements that had been dutifully gathered and then, inexplicably, forgotten. It was a case officially open yet operationally dormant, collecting dust and silently screaming for attention.
But time, as it often does, has a way of loosening lips and revealing buried truths even when they're painful. In the early 2000s, new investigators, notably Josh Hancock and later Mike Gamberg, a former Plumas County deputy who had become a school administrator, returned to the case. Gamberg had a personal connection. He had known the Sharp family through his work, and unlike his predecessors, he was determined not to let the file simply collect more dust.
Gamberg began asking uncomfortable questions, not just about the crime itself, but critically, about the conduct of those who had handled it from the beginning. He started meticulously reopening evidence boxes, digging through decades of neglect. One of his most damning discoveries was a sealed manila envelope, unmarked and gathering dust in the evidence room, easily overlooked.
Inside was a cassette tape dated shortly after the murders. On it, a recorded anonymous call to the Butte County Sheriff's Office. A male voice stated plainly, "I was watching the news and heard about the remains found at Camp 18. I think they belong to Tina Sharp."
Wait, he called before she was officially identified.
Exactly. Think about that for a moment. This call had come in days before Tina's remains were officially identified by dental records, which means the caller knew about the remains and their potential identity before it was public knowledge. Who was the caller? How did he know? Why had this tape been buried in an unmarked envelope for so long? No answers came initially, just more silence, echoing the earlier failures that had plagued the investigation.
Oh,
But that wasn't all. In re-examining old notes and interviews, Gamberg identified two key suspects whose connection to the Sharp family had long been whispered about but never formally pursued. Martin Smart, a local man with a history of domestic violence and a known temper, and his housemate, Bo Bubade, an ex-con with reported ties to organized crime, a shadowy figure with a criminal record.
Martin, as we discussed, had once told a therapist that he might have been involved in the murders, a chilling half-confession. This explosive statement had allegedly been shared with law enforcement at the time.
But, incredibly, the file was missing. The interview was never followed up. When Martin died in 2000, he left behind no official confession, just the fragments of a life that had intersected with profound tragedy, and walked away seemingly untouched by justice. Even in the 21st century, when forensic science had advanced dramatically, critical evidence from Cabin 28 was either lost, compromised beyond use, or simply never collected at all, hobbling any new investigation.
And Gamberg found the hammer.
He did, yes. Gamberg even found a hammer in a local pond that matched one missing from the original crime scene. But it had lain in water for decades. Its secrets were waterlogged and rusted, largely useless for modern forensics, a bitter testament to lost time.
What's fascinating here is the deliberate nature of this suppression of evidence, suggesting a systematic failure rather than mere incompetence.
Right. The deeper Gamberg dug, the more rot he found, not just in the evidence itself, but in the very system that had once been trusted to uphold justice. Justice, it seemed, had not simply failed to appear. It had been withheld, deliberately obstructed. This speaks volumes about the systemic issues at play, hinting at cover-ups or deliberate inaction rather than simple mistakes.
For the town of Keddie, life moved on. The cabins continued to age, the railroad faded further into memory, and newcomers often drove through without ever knowing the unspeakable horrors Cabin 28 once held. The scars of the crime were neither healed nor openly spoken of. They were simply buried beneath layers of quiet survival, a community trying to forget in order to function. But forgetting, as we often learn, always comes with a profound price.
For the surviving Sharp children, especially Sheila, the daughter who tragically discovered the bodies, the trauma lived on in silence, a constant companion. She moved away, built a family, and tried to create a life around the gaping void torn open in her childhood. But grief, especially when it's so violent and unresolved, becomes a kind of echo that never fully leaves the room, always present, just beneath the surface.
Sheila herself once lamented in words that capture the profound weight she carried. "I lost my mother, my brother, my sister, and my sense of safety. But nobody seemed to lose sleep over it but me." A heartbreaking testament to her enduring pain and isolation.
Sheila was not alone in her quiet suffering. The entire community bore its own form of psychological displacement and a lingering unease. Some locals whispered that law enforcement had intentionally ignored crucial leads, perhaps even shielding suspects, leading to a pervasive sense of betrayal. Others simply didn't want to remember, believing that to remember was to reopen old festering wounds that might never heal. And wounds that never truly close sometimes become identities, defining a town and its people.
Cabin 28 itself was eventually demolished, razed to the ground in 2004, its frame splintered and leveled without ceremony. The official reasoning was that it had become an eyesore, a morbid magnet for trespassers and urban legends. But the demolition, to many, felt symbolic. An erasure, an unwillingness to live with the bones of the past, a final act of trying to bury the secret.
And still, to this day, the case remains officially unsolved. The cost of forgetting in cases like Keddie is not just justice denied for the victims and their families. It is the normalization of neglect, where institutional failures become accepted. It is an entire generation growing up in the shadow of unspoken violence, wondering about the truth hidden in plain sight. It is the gradual decay of public trust, when institutions tasked with protection instead deliver absence, apathy, and crushing silence.
To this day, new tips occasionally surface, online sleuths keep forums alive, and dedicated investigators revisit old leads. But for the most part, the Keddie murders live where all unsolved crimes eventually settle, in that haunting liminal space between memory and myth. There's no traditional closure, only endurance. This is about the profound generational impact of unresolved trauma and the erosion of public trust when a community is failed repeatedly by its own institutions.
In the case of the Keddie murders, the sheer brutality of the violence has always begged a central question that no one has been able to fully answer, even after decades. Why? There was no clear robbery, nothing of obvious value was taken from Cabin 28, ruling out a simple, opportunistic crime. The violence, however, was what investigators call overkill, far beyond what was necessary to simply end a life.
This extreme, relentless nature points not just to killing, but to a profound, intensely personal rage or a deliberate message of terror, something deeply unsettling. Whoever committed this horrific crime didn't just intend to kill, they seemingly intended to erase, to punish, to make a statement.
As the years passed, multiple theories about the motive emerged, circling like crows over a hollow landscape of doubt, each offering a glimpse into the possible emotional architecture of the crime. And while none could be conclusively proven in court, they continue to fuel the search for answers. One of the earliest and most persistent theories centered around Martin Smart, who lived nearby and had a documented history of domestic violence, making him a prime suspect in the personal nature of the attack on Sue.
He allegedly told a therapist that he'd killed Sue because she was ruining his marriage, an explosive admission that was tragically overlooked.
Exactly. His wife, Marilyn, had left him shortly after the murders, taking their children and initially voicing her own strong suspicions, only to recant them later under pressure, leaving many to wonder about her true beliefs. Then there was Beau Boubaid, a mysterious figure who had been staying with Smart at the time of the murders. A convicted criminal with ties to organized crime, Beau's presence in Keddie has always felt deeply out of place, almost too calculated for such a rural backdrop.
Some believe the murders were not just personal but also strategic. Perhaps a hit that went sideways, with Tina's abduction potentially tied to silencing her or manipulating others.
That's one line of thought. Others point to a broader web of quiet resentments within the tightly knit community. Sue Sharp, as a single mother in a deeply conservative and traditional area, was sometimes viewed as an outsider because she had left her husband and was raising her children alone, relying on public assistance. She notably offered advice to Marilyn Smart to leave her abusive husband, an act that could have been seen as interference in a private family matter. Sue generally kept to herself, living unconventionally by local standards.
And sometimes, in towns like Keddie, that's tragically enough to breed deep resentment, judgment, and unspoken threats that can escalate in terrifying ways.
There were also quieter whisperings about drugs, jealousy, unpaid debts, and secret lives. Each theory a distinct thread in a tangle that only seemed to tighten with time and the lack of concrete answers. But perhaps the most chilling possibility is this: that there was no one singular motive, only a horrific convergence. That two men, perhaps fueled by enough personal rage and enough disregard for human life, found themselves in a moment where brutality became not only possible, but tragically inevitable.
A moment where vulnerability met violence, and silence became a chilling strategy, a way to bury the truth.
Exactly. The enduring enigma of motive in such a brutal case highlights how the deepest darkness can arise from seemingly ordinary human resentments, festering in isolation. The Keddie case isn't just a mystery of means and opportunity. It's a profound failure of understanding what truly moves people to destroy, and how easily motive can be hidden beneath the banal surface of everyday life.
In 2016, more than 3 decades after the murders, a truly significant discovery was made. Not in the dense woods of Butte County, not by forensic analysts combing through new evidence, but in an old evidence cabinet that had for years simply gathered dust in the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. It was a tape recording, a small cassette. The voice in the tape belonged to a man named Marty Smart, who had been a central figure in early suspicions, the ex-husband of Marilyn.
His words were flat, emotionless, chillingly devoid of remorse as he described a night of confrontation, a boiling rage, and then uttered a single chilling line: "I killed her." He was, in this chilling confession, referring to Sue Sharp.
Wow, this chilling revelation, that crucial evidence was not just overlooked, but seemingly deliberately buried, raises profound questions about the integrity of the initial investigation and the intentions of those involved.
The shocking fact is that this therapy session recording, made in a confidential setting where the psyche speaks more freely, somehow made its way into law enforcement hands. Not only was it logged as evidence, it was then inexplicably ignored. For over 30 years, it sat unheard in the sheriff's office, a silent testament to a hidden truth. Why? Theories abound. Some cite pure incompetence, a small, overwhelmed department simply making colossal errors.
Or something worse, nepotism, corruption.
Others suggest exactly that, pointing out that the original investigators reportedly had ties to the suspects. One of the lead officers, indeed, was allegedly a close friend of Marty Smart. Whether through protection, deliberate suppression, or simply astonishing neglect, the tape had never been submitted to prosecutors, no charges followed, and there was no follow-up investigation allowing a potential killer to walk free.
And worse still, other critical case files, interviews with key witnesses, crime scene photos, even logs of recovered evidence had also mysteriously gone missing, creating an incomplete and fragmented record. When Plumas County bravely reopened the case in the 2010s, investigators described what they found as a mess, a chaotic tangle of misplaced and missing documents.
Critical pieces of evidence had been mislabeled, misfiled, or simply discarded, further complicating any new investigation in the modern age. Then came another stunning revelation unearthed by later investigations. A witness statement from the time of the murders had been recorded, then inexplicably forgotten. A young woman who had been babysitting nearby had seen a stranger calmly leaving the cabin that night. A man she didn't recognize, simply walking calmly into the dark, away from the chaos. Her statement was documented and then, inexplicably, buried.
It is in this profound fog of mishandled evidence, conflicting accounts, and withheld information that the Keddie murders festered for decades, an open wound on the community. The initial investigation was not just flawed, it was deeply fractured by silences that now appear to have been deliberate, creating a sense of betrayal.
In recent years, Plumas County's cold case team has worked tirelessly to rebuild what was lost, piecing together fragments of truth from the wreckage of the past. But in doing so, they are forced to contend with far more than just the passage of time. They face the enduring consequences of institutional failure, of a system that once looked directly at a horrific crime scene and seemingly chose to look away, allowing a monstrous crime to go unpunished.
The lost confession, once buried in a drawer, is now a powerful symbol, not just of guilt, but of how easily the truth can be contained, classified, and profoundly concealed.
By the time new investigators bravely reopened the Keddie case in the 2010s, justice in its most traditional form, arrests, convictions, definitive closure, had grown distant, almost out of reach. The prime suspects were either deceased or unreachable, having disappeared from public life, and the physical evidence had become a puzzle with too many missing pieces and blurred edges, compromised by years of neglect.
Yet despite these immense hurdles, the case simply refused to die. Its echoes persisted, demanding to be heard.
For many in Plumas County, and indeed far beyond, the very notion of justice had evolved. It was no longer solely about arrests or convictions. It had become about truth-telling, about courageously bringing light to where shadows had been protected for far too long, about simply acknowledging what happened. When Sheriff Hagwood, who was himself a young man at the time of the murders, took up the investigation decades later, he didn't promise convictions, knowing the immense challenges. He promised honesty.
That's significant, admitting past failures.
Hugely significant. He spoke openly and with remarkable candor about the early failures of law enforcement, a rare act of institutional introspection. He acknowledged what few officials ever dare to, that the system had profoundly failed the Sharp family and the community it was meant to protect.
Public statements from the Sheriff's Department became less guarded, more human and transparent. Phrases like, "We made mistakes," courageously replaced the bureaucratic opacity of the past, earning new trust. The cold case team made the significant decision to release previously sealed evidence, allowing a new generation of internet sleuths, journalists, and documentarians to meticulously piece together what remained of the fragmented truth.
And with that, something else began to emerge. A collective memory, a shared understanding. Tina Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Sue Sharp were no longer mere footnotes in a forgotten tragedy. They became central figures in a wider reckoning, not just with one brutal night in 1981, but with a pervasive culture of silence and systemic failure that had surrounded it for decades.
Their names were spoken again, with reverence and renewed purpose. Their lives were examined with empathy, not just morbid curiosity, but a genuine desire to understand and remember.
And justice, while not delivered in a courtroom with a gavel's fall, was powerfully revived in remembrance in the collective will not to let them be forgotten. The emergence of documentaries, podcasts, and online forums dedicated to the case created a widening circle of witness, bringing a strange, quiet sense of comfort to those closest to the victims, knowing that people still cared, still asked, still searched for answers, still demanded accountability.
Justice in the Keddie case was not a gavel's fall. It was and continues to be a slow, painful turning toward truth, a collective effort to piece together a fragmented reality. And in that turning, the story no longer belongs solely to the perpetrators or the initial investigators. It profoundly belongs to the memory of those who lived and died in Cabin 28 and to those who refused to forget them.
Your role in this turning toward truth by listening, learning, and remembering stories like this ensures that even without a traditional verdict, a form of justice through remembrance can be achieved, carrying their story forward.
The cabin is gone. Demolished in 2004, its frame splintered and leveled. Some say it was too dark a place, a stain on the landscape that needed to be erased. Others maintain that its destruction was a final, desperate effort to bury what should have been unearthed, a physical act of forgetting.
But even with its absence, the story lingers. The pines still loom over where the cabin once stood, their shadows long and deep, and the wind sounds like breath held too long through their needles. The rusted rails of the old Western Pacific line remain, like scars that never quite healed on the face of the earth.
For some, Keddie is still home, a place they remain tied to by blood and memory. For others, a place they fled, unable to bear the weight of its history. Yet all carry some piece of the night that changed everything. A mother, a son, a friend, a little girl who vanished into the dark and returned as a headline, a chilling reminder of what can be lost. The case remains technically open, leads pursued, theories published, the official files still accessible.
But what remains most palpable in Keddie is not evidence or confession. It is absence. The kind that echoes through time like footsteps heard after the person has gone, a profound void that can never truly be filled. This deep dive into the Keddie murders isn't just about a crime, but about the profound human need for answers, for accountability, and for remembrance, for those whose lives were so violently cut short.
And perhaps that is the final truth of Keddie. That justice, memory, and even peace are not always found in resolution, in a neat legal conclusion. Sometimes they are carried by a sheriff who refused to forget, by a sister who still asks questions and tirelessly searches for answers, and by listeners like you who press play on a story they never knew and find themselves unable to stop thinking about it, becoming part of that widening circle of witness. The forest never truly forgets, and neither truly should we. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration has offered you not just facts, but a deeper understanding of the enduring power of an unsolved mystery and the profound human need to remember.